The following program is a production of Pioneer Public Television.
Hello and welcome to Compass, a production of Pioneer Public Television. I'm Les Heen, your host for Compass. This is a weekly discussion of public policy and important issues facing our viewing area. This week, we will discuss how prairie management and restoration preserve prairie landscapes in our region. We'll also look at the importance of prairies for natural beauty and the environment. First, we talked with Doug Bury, who has worked on the Flynn Prairie Nature Trail in Millbank, South Dakota since that project started. Bury shows us the management efforts and work that went into creating the prairie from farmland. Pioneer's Laura K. Prosser has the story.
We are walking through the Flynn Prairie. I'm with Doug. He is a volunteer prairie manager at the Nature Trail in Millbank, South Dakota.
Doug, why don't you tell us a little bit about this beautiful land we see before us?
Well, we have about 90 acres here. The 10 years ago was a corn soybean field. Over that time period, we've changed it from what is just a regular ag field. We've changed it to a reconstructed northern tallgrass prairie. And included in the prairie, you can see we're walking on a trail. It's about 1.5 mile trail. People get a chance to come out, walk, bike, walk their dog, get out in what is away from town, even though we were right on the edge of Millbank. And people can enjoy that, and at the same time they can see the prairie as it was back when Lewis and Clark came through.
I'm feeling the history. Let's take a look.
And there's approximately 65 different species of forbs and grasses that have been planted out here, and they were all native to this area pre-settlement. So we were trying to reconstruct as closely as possible to what was originally here. Now, it's not exactly, a reconstruction will never be back to a normal native tallgrass prairie. If you're making an omelet, you will crack the egg. You can never get the egg back together. We've glued the eggshell back together, and so this looks quite similar to a tallgrass prairie, a native tallgrass prairie, an original one, but it is not. It is a construction, and we ended up pretty close to what this would look like 100, 200 years ago. We don't get a chance to see a native prairie. Of all the prairie, this whole area that we live in, this entire area was northern tallgrass prairie at one time. Now, there's less than 2% of it left. 98% is gone. 98% of it is parking lots and houses and roads and corn and soybeans. We only have 2% left. In Minnesota, it's less than that. It might be 1% or even less. So it's an extremely endangered ecosystem. Northern tallgrass prairie is probably one of the most endangered ecosystems on the planet. We think of the rainforest, half of the Brazilian rainforest is gone. 98% of the northern tallgrass prairie is gone, just gone. And once you break that egg, you can never get it back.
When it comes to reconstruction and what plants go in and what plants do not go in, it's up to the past and to those in charge of prairie management.
Nothing that was planted out here came from anywhere 100 miles north or 200 miles south. No species were planted out here that didn't originally exist in northeastern South Dakota. Early in the season, we have a certain group of flowers that are blooming. Right now, we've got large flowered penstemon. In a month or 2 months, we're going to start to see the goldenrod. There's quite a few different species of goldenrod out here. We've got a lot of flowers that bloom out here. And they don't all bloom at the same time, and when they're not blooming, they look a great deal like weeds. But beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We do have invasive species. It's a real management problem, not only in a reconstruction, but it's a management problem on native prairie. There's so many things that have been introduced that really were never here in the first place. And they compete, and sometimes compete very viciously almost, with the natives. Smooth brome is one grass that gets started. Canada thistle. We never think of it this way, but trees are a problem. The tallgrass prairie originally was self-managed by fire, and that kept the trees out. We don't have quite that control anymore. So management probably comes down to controlling the invasive species, the non-natives. Sometimes we win and sometimes we just keep struggling.
But how does one control a prairie? What techniques are available to aid management in this endeavor?
So there's a whole number of things that come up that have to be looked at, trying to keep it like it should be. In a very limited way, we do use chemical to some extent that we have to, but for the most part, the number one way of managing a prairie is with fire. We have burned this, I believe, twice. Sometimes being able to get a burn through here is not just going out with a gallon of gas and a box of matches. We are right next to Millbank, and we can't have smoke coming into town. We can't endanger other things. So it has to be burned in a very particular way. It's called a prescribed burn. One of the questions we do get from people quite frequently is, what do you do about mosquitoes? Nothing is the answer. We don't have a particular mosquito problem out here. In town, they spray for mosquitoes through the whole summer, and we are inundated by mosquitoes. Also, the chemical that kills mosquitoes kills all the bees, kills the butterflies. We see a lot of monarch butterflies out here. You're not going to see a monarch butterfly in town after they've been spraying for mosquitoes.
The monarchs aren't the only advantage to having a prairie so close to town. The other side of it is the education and awareness it brings.
A prairie is a chance for people who appreciate it to talk to people who don't. Give this other person the opportunity to understand what a prairie is. That it's not a manicured lawn, it doesn't look like a lawn, and nor should it be, and it can't exist as a lawn. The biggest bit of advice I can give is put away your lawnmower. Because if you mow it, then nothing lives in a lawn. Robin may hop across it, but nothing lives in a lawn. That's a pretty sterile environment. If you let it grow up, if it was native in the first place, it will come back, and it will come back very, very strongly. Show them the flowers that are blooming. Go in the spring and see large flowered penstemon. Go in the fall and see all the different goldenrod. Go late in the fall after a freeze and you think everything else is frozen and New England aster will still be blooming. And if you think that, roses and petunias are hardy, they're really not. Not when you have prairie species that are called ripgut and rattlesnake root. Now that doesn't sound like a nice, easygoing plant. It's persistent. Native prairie is tough as long as we leave it alone.
With us now to talk about regional managed efforts and the science behind them, we have two guests. We have Sarah Vosick, the Minnesota Wetland Management District biologist, and we also have Joe Blastic from the Nature Conservancy of Clear Lake, South Dakota. Joe, Sarah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
I'd like to start a bit first about what you do. Joe, tell us a bit about the Nature Conservancy and your work over in Clear Lake.
So my specific work area is eastern South Dakota into southwest Minnesota on the Prairie Coteau region. The Prairie Coteau crosses borders, so I have a really unique role in managing in two different states on a daily basis. And the Nature Conservancy itself is a nonprofit conservation organization. It's worldwide. We focus in countries across the world and have a chapter in every state in the U.S.
Okay, great. Thanks for being with us. And Sarah, your work with the Management District?
Sure. So I actually work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is part of the federal government. And within the Fish and Wildlife Service, there's a organization called the National Wildlife Refuge System. And so a lot of people know about refuges that are around their home area. We actually work for part of that that's called Wetland Management Districts. So We've got, in our district, we've got 50,000 acres of federal land that's scattered through 8 counties that we manage, focusing on prairie management and wetland management and wildlife habitat.
Great. Thanks again for joining us on Compass. I'd like to talk first about the importance of prairies, because of course we hear a lot about prairies and how the entire region was prairies, and now there's native prairies, a very small percentage left. So why are prairies so important to our region? And Sarah, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, yeah, you kind of hit on it there. The number that we use often is to talk about how there's really less than 1% of the original prairie left in Minnesota, which is a pretty dramatic number when you think about it. A lot of people don't even realize that when they look around their hometown, that used to all be prairie hundreds of years ago. And it's a really unique ecosystem. There's a lot of really important wildlife habitat and pollinator benefits and water quality and all kinds of things that it provides for us.
Sure. Joe, your perspective on the importance of prairies?
Oh, it's critical, and we're losing it at an unprecedented rate right now. In the northeastern part of the state, we worked on a project with SDSU, and we identified of the 5 million acre landscape on the east South Dakota side, there's about 1 million acres left, which is right around 20%. And then in southwest Minnesota, work with the same project, there's roughly 8% of native prairie left. So we don't have a lot left, and it's really critical to protect and manage what we do have.
So we should mention for our viewers who aren't necessarily very close to the region, SDSU, you're talking about South Dakota State University in Brookings, right?
Correct, yeah.
They're ag outreach folks. I know that when you say prairie, it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So what are the different kinds of prairie management when we think about it? Because there's more than one kind of prairie. Sarah?
Sure. We think sometimes differently in our field of work about grasslands versus prairie. When we say prairie, we really mean native remnant prairie that's never seen a plow. And then there are all sorts of planted grasslands out on the landscape too, like things that are enrolled in farm programs like Conservation Reserve Program. And a lot of our areas that we actually manage are restored prairies that have been planted back and have a farming history. So there's a variety of different ways that grasslands can look, but prairies are special because they are original and never been broken. So you'll find plants and insects and other critters living in there that you wouldn't find anyplace else in the world, really.
Yeah. A uniqueness to the ecosystem. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Joe?
Well, Sarah's spot on, and there's different ways if you have a prairie or grassland and managing it, and fire is a pretty historic way of managing grass. You've got haying, grazing, and then aesthetics. People just like to have grass to have habitat for wildlife. So there's a handful of different ways of doing it. It just depends on what your goal is for what you have left.
Well, I know we talked a bit ago about the differences, the 1% or the percentage of prairie that's left, and then there's the native prairie, and then there's the restoration. So how is it different really when you've got an area that, say, needs to be restored or brought back? What is that process like, and how is that prairie different when you have to do that sort of restoration? Tell me about that, Sarah.
It's actually more complicated than you would think, and especially when we're trying now to really focus in on recreating as close as we can a prairie to look as similar to a native prairie as we can. We talk about them as reconstructions. That's the term that we use, is reconstructing a prairie. And it's not quite as simple as just throwing some grass seed in the ground. When I've done some prairie surveys on some of our native prairies, and we can have upwards of 200 different species of plants, grasses and flowers and shrubs and things growing in there. We can't buy all that. It's not available commercially, so we have to do a lot of work to harvest seed to put back out there. But then you have to sort of keep your fingers crossed that some of the different insects that are needed to pollinate those plants show up on their own. Do they? We don't know. And just some of the wildlife and things. We put the seeds out and kind of build it and hope they come.
Sure, and then I suppose that process can then take a long time in terms of monitoring and seeing where you go, right?
Yeah, and it can be, we usually think of the first, 5 years, I suppose, would you say, as being our sort of setup phase where we do the planting and there's some initial weediness. Just like if you were building a house, it takes a while for it to get to a state where you can live in it. Sort of the same thing when you're planting a prairie. It can be a few years before that community really takes off and is well established and then from then on, we're managing it to maintain that with fire and grazing and haying, the things that Joe was talking about.
Are you seeing the same sort of things when you look at a prairie? Are you thinking it's going to take a long time to really get this to where we would like it to be?
Yeah, it does take time, and I think that's where you just have to have patience. Like Sarah said, those first couple of years are a little bit more weedy looking. You're not going to have your bright wildflowers. But you have to have patience and let things kind of play out a little bit and not jump the gun. That's the kind of the key to success, I think, is just taking a step back and saying let nature do its thing and give it time to do it.
And I suppose that's a challenge for people, because when people think of prairies, they may think of a set of grasses or a particular seed mix that they would buy, and they think, okay, now, how is that going to look differently in 5 and 10 years? As people drive by, are there things that they would necessarily be able to see if they stopped and looked very easily about a prairie that's in the first few years versus the next 5 to 10 years after that? Or are there ways for them to spot that?
Well, I think there are for the trained eye. The first couple of years when it is weedy, it might not look so appealing, but once you drive past that place for a few years in a row, you should see that transition to more flowers and colors and start to see that wildlife kind of transition over as well.
And I suppose in the last few years we've heard a lot of discussion about pollinators and the importance of pollinators and pollinator-friendly environments. Is that another part of this too, is then looking at what are the flowers and looking at those sorts of things,
Sure.
Sarah?
Yeah, and we've, in the past when we've reconstructed prairies, we've tried really hard to make sure that there's a wide diversity of plants growing in them. But one thing we've really paid attention to now more with the pollinator concerns is to be sure that we've got flowers that are blooming through the whole season, not just in the spring or in the late summer, and make sure that we've got flowers that are all different colors. Some like orange plants and some like blue plants, and they're kind of picky sometimes. So it's a different approach to things, similar, but I think we're refining how we approach it and getting better and better at it as we practice. So.
Sure. Now, again, if people are driving by prairies and they're looking at these things, one of the things they might not be able to see from the road, in addition to the details, is how big a prairie is. Because we've heard a lot in the news over the years about fragmentation. You have maybe a small prairie there and a small prairie there. Are there sort of targets that you look at in terms of when you want a restoration project that it should be at least a certain size? Are there sort of benchmarks people can understand there? Or is that too challenging of a number? A few acres versus 50 or 100? Or
that's a tricky number. It depends on if the place you're working at is next to a native prairie. I would say any prairie restoration is a valuable restoration at this point in time, but bigger is always better.
Mm-hmm. It depends on what your goals are too. A lot of people are starting to use prairie plants just in their garden or planting a little half-acre section in their backyard and enjoying that. And I wouldn't necessarily call that a prairie reconstruction, but it's a good step in the right direction. And but if you really want to provide good habitat for a lot of our native grassland birds, you do need much bigger landscapes, big open grassy landscapes for them.
So it sounds like there are just some management challenges as people start to work on prairies and prairie restoration. What are some of the common sort of management challenges once people start looking more seriously at prairie restoration?
I think one of the big challenges is having that patience and time, and that it's a lot more than just throwing seed out and waiting for the flowers to grow. It takes time for keeping up with your noxious weeds, and then once you get your prairies going, there is annual maintenance. You just don't plant it and walk away.
When you say annual maintenance, what sort of thing does that mean?
Brush control. If you want a prairie, you want that wide open landscape with not a lot of invasive trees. Noxious weeds, those sorts of things. That it does take some labor to keep a good one going.
So taking out things like maybe eastern red cedar, or it could be I suppose buckthorn. What are the sort of things that you run into?
I think a lot of times you run into Siberian elm, eastern red cedars. Elms are real fast growing and put up in tree belts in a lot of places, and they really grow like gangbusters out in plantings.
A lot of those elms came up, I think, during the Depression, didn't they, as a way for shelter belts, right? And the legacy we have now is we find them all over prairies.
Yeah, yep.
Yeah. So management challenges there. What about benefits? I mean, when you think about it, as you've looked at these prairies that have been there for a long time, what are some of the benefits that we can see from some of these prairies? And Joel, I'll start with you.
I think as you start going, you start to see those plant community changes, and you're getting the habitat, the wildlife. There's definitely a people benefit too, that people like to go see prairies. Prairies help clean water. It's a great filter. The wetlands. We're in the prairie pothole region, so if you're protecting prairie, there's a wetland associated with it, and sometimes that gets overlooked. So it's very multifaceted.
So when you talk about you're talking about, so like if it's an upland and you're looking at a wetland, you're talking about the filtering effect and those sorts of things of the water. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Sarah?
I think I like what Joe was saying too about just the human benefits of it and just enjoying it. A lot of people don't realize that prairie is what we had here many years ago, and it's fun to be able to take, I've got 2 little kids, it's fun to take them out there and walk around and start pointing out that that grass is different than that grass and it's different than that grass. And a lot of people visit the mountains or vast forests, and it's easy for people to see that huge landscape as something amazing. And a prairie, you have to get down and sit in it for a little while to appreciate just how diverse and incredible it is. And so I think that just if you have that patience and can sit for a long time and get to see some of the different little spiders that are living inside of a flower that you just would miss if you drove by on the road.
So it sounds like something that is, for you, not as dramatic as the landscapes that we often would see in pictures where people think they're going to travel to the mountains, but you have to sort of go to it and then you have to spend a little bit more time with it and really sort of learn it in a different way? It's
just a little more subtle. So you don't even have to necessarily know the names of all the plants and animals, but if you spend a bit more time, I think, you can pick up on its own kind of drama.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to drive past a prairie. You think of mountains, you think of big vistas and skylines, and prairie's a little more subtle, and like Sarah said, they just take a little bit of time and stepping back and taking a closer look.
In our part of the world too, they are. You mentioned fragmentation. Our prairies are usually smaller chunks of land compared to a huge landscape. You get out further west in our country, and there still are very, very expansive areas of grassland, and you can kind of imagine what that pretty dramatic landscape would have looked like.
Yeah, sure. And of course, if you read any of the journals of the people who first came to the prairies, there's some pretty dramatic descriptions of the height of the grasses and the grasses that seem to go on forever. So it's sort of difficult for a lot of people, I think, to appreciate what it might have been at that point. So I know we've been looking at prairie management restoration for a very long time in some areas, and it's been, a project here and a project there. How has prairie management changed over time? Or in other words, what do we know about prairie management now that we're doing better than maybe we did 20 or 30 years ago? Sarah?
I think, one way to look at it is that, like every profession, the ideas and ideals change over time. You wouldn't walk into your doctor's office and expect them to use the same technology that they were using in 1960, right? And the same is true for our profession when we're thinking about wildlife management or conservation biology, that we've done a lot of work over the last several decades and learned more about how the ecosystem works, and we're thinking a lot more about how to maintain that prairie ecosystem and all of its little bits and pieces, rather than just focusing in on maybe one animal like a duck or a pheasant. Those are important and we love them, but they're just part of the bigger picture that we're thinking about now. So again, I think we're just refining maybe what we had been doing in the past and learning as we go.
Sure.
I think now we're paying attention more to some of the more subtle things, the insect communities, the pollinators. Before it was maybe easier to focus on the bigger game animals, but as fragmentation and things are taken into effect, it's the smaller critters that are going away too, and people are TNC and everybody's paying attention to that.
What would some of the smaller critters be? I'm just curious.
Well, you got the butterflies, Dakota skipper. That's probably the newest butterfly species.
It's a butterfly that's restricted just to prairies and just to native prairie as far as we know, and they are just within the last year or two have been listed on the federal endangered species list. So something a lot of us are starting to pay attention to.
Yeah.
So all those little things I think are taking a front seat now. So we're trying to manage for all of our grasses and plants, as well as all the critters too, and less of an area to do that.
Yeah. So after all of these years of looking at prairies and appreciating prairies, where you've both spent a lot of time, what's ahead as we look to the last 2-3 minutes of our discussion here? What do we expect in the future on prairies and prairie management? Joe?
Oh, I hope that people start realizing the importance of them and start protecting them and kind of being more proactive for taking advantage of what we have left and taking full acknowledgement of what we have left. I think that's going to be really important, that the producers that have cows and those sorts of things, they have the last bit of treasure, that's left out there, really. So to hit home that point that it's important is really critical.
We talk about that a lot too with landowners who have a little bit of prairie left maybe in their pasture, that that's a special thing. When you're talking less than 1% of that left in our state, you have a little bit of history right there in your farm, and that's a pretty precious thing. So.
And I realize both of you know particular areas that you study very well. But if someone wanted to go out and have a prairie walk, or walk through a prairie, or walk on a trail, any favorite spots that you'd suggest? Sarah, I mean, obviously I'm sure you have a favorite spot, by the wetland management district.
Yeah, well, I actually live close to Appleton here, and one of my favorite spots is actually one of the spots that Joe manages. Just near Appleton, we've got a couple of really beautiful, huge prairies. The Chippewa Prairie Preserve, that's co-managed by the Nature Conservancy and the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And just a jump across Lackaparra Lake, we've got a couple of waterfowl production areas that are in that same landscape that are some pretty significant areas and some of the biggest chunks of remnant native prairie that we've got left in the state.
So, Joe, in addition to the spot that she just said that you've managed and worked on, other particular places that you'd suggest?
The Chippewa Prairie is probably one of my favorites, and then just south of the town of Lake Benton, there's another pretty large TNC site that's got some really great prairie, and it's real high, dry, rolling hills and a lot of topography. So those are my two favorites for sure.
And very quickly, suggestions where people can go to learn more about prairies in their area, particular websites or other places they should go. Sarah?
Yeah, if people look on the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources website, there's a section of that that's dedicated to the Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan, which is a plan that a number of different conservation organizations and agencies put together, and it's got lots of background information.
Okay.
And TNC has a website, nature.org, and you can click on places we work, and then that'll lay out the states, and you can pick where you want to look and sites you might want to go and visit.
Okay, great. Thank you both, Joe Blasek of the Nature Conservancy and Sarah Vosek from the Morris Wetlands Management District. Thanks for joining us on Compass.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That's it for this week on Compass. Join us next week for more people, places, and issues in our region. Thanks.